Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Bow, 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 bow.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Freedom Now.
Freedom now.
Freedom Now at KPFK. Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off, as always, with a special thank you to all of you loyal listeners who continue to support Freedom Now through this latest season of Fund Drive. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, August 6, 2022. Black August is upon us yet again, so you know we have to start things off strong as a tribute and homage to the rich history of rebellion and revolutionary spirit symbolized by this month. From the onset of the Haitian Revolution in August 1791 to the Watts Revolt of August 1965 and the Pasadena Courthouse Revolt of August 1970, led by none other than Jonathan Jackson, there is something about the month of August that says no more to the forces of imperialism and colonialism. With that, let's get into our agenda for today. We begin with our dear sister Luyanda Kaboka, writing the ways of history to give us the historical drumbeat calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, Dr. Gerald Horne will be in conversation with Jovan Lewis, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Geography at the University of California at Berkeley. More importantly, Professor Lewis is a proud member of the Reparations Task Force in the state of California, working to bring justice and compensation to California's Black population impacted by the history of slavery in the United States and specifically here in California. There are many questions to ask and hurdles to jump on this road to reparations, and Professor Lewis is on the line to make it plain for us here on Freedom Now, so stay tuned. Then, in the second half of our program, we'll be hearing from Randy Krehbiel, a reporter with the Tulsa World in Oklahoma and author of the book Tulsa 1921, Reporting a Massacre. Hopefully by now we all know about Black Wall Street and the horrific actions taken by white haters working to tear down this bustling Black economic center in what became known as the Tulsa Race Riot. Now, while we may know about some of the events that took place, Krehbiel is here to give us some additional historical context and details that will shed even more light on this dark time in our history, and you will not want to miss it. Now, while we are in Fund Drive and are still able to bring you this much quality content, we want to remind you to call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org and pledge your support to the station at any level. Remember, these are all tax-deductible donations, and you can become a member for just $25, maybe $50, maybe $75, or if you're feeling really generous, slide us that nice 100 piece and help us keep Freedom Now on the air to bring you this type of programming. Again, that's 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735 to support our efforts here at Freedom Now. Now, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now. KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Oliver Nelson, Roy Ayers, Freddie Hubbard, Cedar Walton, and Mongo Santa Maria. Now, people, get ready for this train a-comin', taking you one step closer to mental liberation. And stay tuned for the beat of that historical drum, followed by a conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Jovan Lewis.
Freedom or death? Molweni Ekai. This is Sister Luyanda Koboka with this week's African Drumbeat Historical Calendar here at KPFK 90.7 FM and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. August 8th, early 18th century. Nanny Griggs, a literate Barbadian African freedom fighter, on the Simons Plantation in the Caribbean organizes a militant corps of slaves, which were linked to similar groups throughout the island. The militants led by Nanny led a slave rebellion that was briefly successful. August 9th, 1956. 20,000 African women marched in Pretoria, South Africa, to protest laws forcing them to carry passbooks, a tactical action in the overall struggle for Azania's liberation from the settler colonialism led by women. August 10th, 1945. Josina Michel, the founder of the women's wing of Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, Frelimo, was born. Frelimo was the leading organization which led the political and military resistance to Portuguese colonialism and liberated African women and men from the brutal dictatorship of Portuguese imperialism. August 11th, 1905. W.E.B. Du Bois, Monroe Trotter, and others meet in Canada to organize the Niagara Movement, the precursor to the NAACP. Their statement, "We refuse to allow the impression to remain that the Negro American assents to inferiority, is submissive under oppression, and apologetic before insults." August 11th, 1965. The Watts Rebellion occurred. A contemporary African resistance movement, though disorganized, had a focus against police brutality and the dreadful conditions facing Africans and other members of the unemployed, working class, and people of color. August 12, 1976. 3,000 Palestinians massacred at Tal al-Zafar, Beirut, by the Phalanges and Zionist forces in the continued onslaught against Palestinian struggle for self-determination and the right to their homeland, what is mislabeled Israel. August 13th, 1926. Fidel Castro, the embodiment of the Cuban Revolution, was born. Every U.S. president from Dwight Eisenhower in 1959 to the present-day Baby Bush, 12 U.S. presidents who have sworn to overthrow the socialist state off the coast of Florida. Subcomandante Fidel has outlasted them all due to the power of the people in defending the socialist gains of Cuba. David versus Goliath. August 13th, 1918. Red Bloody Summer begins in the United States. Over 25 white racist wars against Africans occurred, which together with the highest rates of lynchings during that period lays the basis for the rise of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League led by Marcus Mosiah Garvey. August 13th, 1521. Spanish conquistador Cortés conquers the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, beginning the long Spanish colonial rule and their efforts to demolish traditional indigenous culture and languages of pre-contact Mexico and the promotion of the European colonial culture. This has been a brief overview of some of the historical struggle of Africans and the oppressed against all forms of exploitations, whether slavery, feudalism, capitalism, or imperialism. We should gain strength and motivation from the historical truism that wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. Today, the twin evils of the United States and Israel imperialism, two settler colonies, are our new targets, and as with all empires, they will inevitably collapse. Join us in our freedom chant of Amandla Awetu, which means the power belongs to the masses, not the rich. Amandla Awetu, Amandla Awetu, Amandla Awetu.
The historical calendar is such a great tradition and a reminder of the importance of Freedom Now here on KPFK, and we need your support to keep that tradition alive. So call 818-985-KPFK, that's 818-985-5735, or go online to kpfk.org to donate and pledge your support, and you can bring home some great wisdom for your bookshelf. That's right. Call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, or go online to kpfk.org to donate right now. I now send you over to Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined on the line by Professor Jovan Lewis. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is Randy Krehbiel, a reporter with the Tulsa World in Oklahoma, and author of the book Tulsa 1921, Reporting a Massacre. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Randy Krehbiel.
Thank you, sir.
So tell us, what was the Tulsa Massacre of 1921 and why did you decide to write about it?
All right. Well, the Tulsa Massacre, or as it's also known as the Tulsa Race Riot, but the terminology today is the Tulsa Race Massacre, was an event that occurred over about 18 hours or so on the night of May 31st and the morning of June 1st, 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the net result of it was that about 36 square blocks of Black homes and businesses and even a school or two were destroyed and pretty utterly destroyed. And these were things that people had worked their lifetime to build up, to acquire. And there's a large number of people killed. The exact number is not known. You'll hear numbers of 200 or 300. At the time, I've seen estimates of between 50 and 500. So that was at the time. So it's really hard to say how many people were killed. Most of those were black people. There were a few white people killed too, at least 12. Some people think it was a lot more. There's some interesting stories about that too that we probably don't have time to go into. But as a reporter, I was assigned to a commission that was formed by the legislature in the late 1990s. And I started covering it in 1999. Over the years, I accumulated an awful lot of information because when I was given the assignment, part of it was to do my own research and start putting together an archive for our newspaper, because we didn't really have a lot in our clip files. We had the microfilm, but we didn't of the newspapers of the day, but we really didn't have a lot in our clip files. So I had all this stuff, and at some point around probably 2014 or 15 or 16, I began to realize that I was not going to be around forever, and maybe it was a good idea if I took all that stuff I had and tried to put it into a narrative to leave behind for whoever at the Tulsa World would be writing about it next. And sort of one thing led to another, and it turned into a book. It was not, I mean, I sort of thought, well, it could be a book, but that was not the primary reason at the outset for putting it together.
Now, it's notable that this took place in Oklahoma because we know that there were indigenous slave owners, and unlike many slave owners throughout Dixie, they were forced to disgorge more of their resources to their enslaved property. And to what extent were Black people in Tulsa enriched as a result of that disgorging process? And to what extent did the massacre wipe out their riches?
I think there's a couple of ways. So at the end of the Civil War, and by the treaty, it's complicated, but at the end of the Civil War, the federal government came in and said, well, you guys fought for the Confederacy, which was partly true. There were actually the 5 tribes citizens fought on both sides during the Civil War, but the governments of the 5 tribes, it's the Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminoles, had signed treaties with the Confederacy. So the federal government came in and treated them as part of the Confederacy, made them sign new treaties, and as part of those treaties, the former slaves became citizens of the tribe. As a result of that, then, decades later, in the late 1900s, when the Indian nations were broken up and all of the land was allotted to the individual members, the freedmen and their descendants received allotments the same as the Indians did. So some of those allotments turned out to be pretty valuable. And in a lot of cases, the freedmen seem to have been more aware of the value of these allotments than the tribal members. They tended to be rather more eager to accept the allotments, because a lot of the Indians never even recognized allotments. The freedmen did, and a lot of them got pretty good farmland out of the deal. And then as things developed, some of that land had oil and gas on it. So, and oil was actually the main thing in the early days. So you had some Black people who, African Americans, who had who were able to, you had a farm, that's an asset. You had oil on it, that's another asset. Now, it was not always easy to hang on to that, because there were a lot of tactics used to, get that, not just from Black Americans, but also from the Indians or the indigenous people. And so there was that, and most of those people tended not to live in Tulsa. However, there's a school of thought that a lot of that money made its way to Tulsa because it was kind of, like going to the big city. It wasn't that big, but by the standards of the day, I guess it was. And so that money tended to flow into Greenwood. And then when Greenwood was destroyed, of course, the benefit from those years of that money flowing into Greenwood was destroyed. People, in those days, as best I can tell, people tended to keep their wealth in physical assets, in capital assets. So you might not have a lot of cash laying around, but you put it into your property. And this is probably a little bit off of your question, but one of the things that struck me in my years of reading on this was just how important it was to African Americans to own property. Property was a real sign of wealth. I think it was more important in some ways than, having cash in your pocket. People didn't trust banks in those days. We didn't have the FDIC or any of that stuff. And so if you had your money in property, you knew it was going to be there. And, in this massacre, all of that was just literally burned to the ground. If you've seen pictures, it's just devastated. There's hardly, one brick on top of another. I don't know how else to describe it.
Mm-hmm. Now, my understanding is that what triggered the massacre was an allegation by a young white woman that a young black man had accosted her on an elevator. Is that accurate?
It's accurate to an extent, and if it's okay, I'll explain what I mean. So that was the thing that got everybody's attention, and it occurred on May 30th, which was Veterans Day. It happened downtown, and the allegation was that this young black man had in some way touched or molested or whatever this white girl who really was probably only about 15 years old. She was an elevator operator in a building there. And a day later, the black fellow who was known as Dick Rowland, he was arrested and taken first to the city jail and then to the county jail. The county jail was considered to be quite a bit more secure. The afternoon newspaper, the Tulsa Tribune, ran a story about this arrest and the incident that was pretty, in those days, if all over the country, black men were being killed for what today we would think of as pretty minor things, and a lot of them involved, something that was deemed inappropriate towards a white woman. So the story was, it got people's attention. So, a crowd began to gather at the courthouse because, the reason he was taken to the courthouse is the police commissioner had gotten a phone call from someone saying, we're going to get, that guy. We're going to get Dick Rowland. I don't think it was probably those words exactly, but you get the picture. And so they were concerned about him being, something bad happening to him essentially being lynched. And so they moved him to the county. And that word got around that that something was going on. Apparently the telephone lines just were completely tied up. The telephone company reported a record amount of activity, and they had to call in all their off-duty operators to, complete the calls. That was in the days when you still had to have an operator to complete a call. So he's at the courthouse. People started gathering around. Well, then the word went around in Greenwood, in the black community, that hey, they're gonna lynch this guy. And there'd already been a commitment by some people in that community that we're not going to, even before the Dick Rowland incident, that if something like this ever comes up, we're going to resist it. And so there were, several waves of armed black men went to the courthouse, which involved, walking through the white business district to get there. And always they were convinced, they were talked into returning until finally, about 10 o'clock in the evening, somebody, it appears to me that it was probably a guy who'd run for sheriff and lost, and he wanted to prove to everybody he should be the sheriff. He tried to disarm one of these black men, the gun went off, and then, there was just a mass panic. And out of that, then came the destruction of Greenwood. So I would make the argument that in the end, and I should point out that when that happened, everybody forgot about Dick Rowland. He was like the safest guy in person in town, because he was on the 5th floor of the courthouse with about 8 deputy sheriffs barricaded in the jail, refusing to let anybody in. And so everybody forgot about Dick Rowland, and it became about burning down Greenwood. So I'd kind of make the argument that in the end, it was less about Dick Rowland and more about the fact that these African-American men stood up for Dick Rowland. That they went to the courthouse with their guns, and they made it clear, if you try and take him, we're going to put up a fight. You're going to pay a price. And, in those days, it seems like there was nothing that white people hated and feared more than a black man with a gun.
Finally, Randy Krehbiel, reporter with the Tulsa World and author of the book Tulsa 1921, Reporting a Massacre, bring us up to date. That is to say, understand, number one, that there have been searches of burial grounds, what they come up with, and number two, what are the prospects for reparations to those who might still be alive and or their descendants?
In terms of the burials, over the last 2 years, there's been a pretty concerted effort to, look for remains. The nature of these things makes it that it's kind of, they do it a while and then they leave and then they come back. And so it hasn't been like every day they're out there, but somebody's been working on it pretty much every day, I think, in some way or another. To make a long story short, they excavated one area that they thought was promising, and it turned out that there was nothing there, literally nothing there. And so then they went to another place where they were pretty sure there were at least 2 men killed in the fighting were buried. And they found a really interesting place. It appeared that there were probably about 18 coffins, and they were in 2 rows, stacked one on top of the other. And but the coffins, I mean, these were, when I say coffins, there was almost nothing left of it. I mean, only experienced archaeologists would have known what they were looking at. Now, some of the coffins, I guess, were fairly intact, but a lot of them, there was nothing. So, and they worked on that a while, and they actually exhumed a number of sets of remains. And from those, they were able to get DNA from 2 sets of remains. And that DNA is now with a company that's analyzing it, and they're trying to see if they can, match it with any living person to, identify these folks. It's a little confusing because, back in 1921, at the time, they said there were 18 Black people buried in this. I should say this is in a cemetery. It's in Oak Lawn Cemetery in Tulsa. And so they were pretty sure there were 18 people buried there. Some of them at the time were identified, some were not, but the graves are not identified. And so, again, it seems like it's going to be difficult, but they're working on it. In terms of reparations, there is a lawsuit underway now. There have been lawsuits in the past. They have not been successful. This one is at the state court level, and it's moving slowly. I don't know what to say. There are 3 people who've been identified as survivors. Of course, they're all well over 100 years old by now. And but this lawsuit also includes, it's kind of an interesting lawsuit, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know how this works. It's seeking reparations for the survivors and then descendants of people killed, or not necessarily killed, but people who lost property in the massacre. But then it's also seeking reparations for what it says is continued abuse of the Black community, and so I don't know. That's ongoing, and that's where it is. I can't say that there's any kind of. I mean, there are calls for reparations from the state, from the city, and that sort of thing. But at this point, I don't see that as politically. It doesn't seem like it's a viable course.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Randy Krehbiel, reporter at the Tulsa World and author of the book Tulsa, 1921, Reporting a Massacre. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thanks for your interest.
Thank you.
Special thanks to Professor Jovan Lewis for sharing his hard-earned knowledge with us. Where else can you get such quality content, context, and historical perspective other than Freedom Now? Call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate and support the show by donating today, and get one of our awesome premiums to expand your library and your mind. Dr. Horne, tell the people a little bit about what they can take home today.
Donate $100 and receive a signed copy of Gerald Horne's latest book, hot off the presses, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. Fascism, which may be around the corner in the United States, is a combination of both slavery and Jim Crow, and is presently creeping into North America on little cat feet, with Texas in the vanguard. In order to be defeated, it must be understood. In order to be understood, this book must be consulted. Why is it that so many Black people in California have roots in Texas, including the first Black mayor, Tom Bradley, the first Black mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, the entertainer and actor and singer, Jamie Foxx? Read this book if you have roots in Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma. Where else but on Freedom Now can you not only find out about fascism, but find out about Black American fraternities and sororities like the Omegas and the Alphas and the Deltas. Be the first on your block, in your school, in your church, in your fraternity or sorority that has a copy of the Counter-Revolution of 1836. Understand why it was that it was Texas that led the war against Mexico, which led to the United States seizing California in the first place. Why is Texas in the vanguard of cracking down on so-called critical race theory, cracking down on women's reproductive freedom, cracking down on the population of Mexican descent? Why does Texas have the largest Black population in the United States? Why is it that the seeds for the impending overthrow of Roe versus Wade, a step towards enhanced patriarchy and fascism, were planted in Texas? Where else but Freedom Now can you get serious historical analysis of the LAPD or serious analysis of Black fraternities and sororities? Pick up the phone and donate $100 and receive a signed copy of the Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of U.S. Fascism.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. And folks, there you have it. Call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate right now and make your support for the show and the station felt. Now we're going to keep this train moving and send you back over to Dr. Horne, who's being joined by Randy Krehbiel right here on Freedom Now. The mic is yours, Dr. Horne.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with me on the line is Jovan Lewis, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Geography at the University of California at Berkeley. For our purposes here, in 2021, he was appointed by California Governor Gavin Newsom to serve on the state's Reparations Task Force. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Lewis.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So what was the what is the Reparations Task Force?
Yes, so again, it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. The Reparations Task Force in the state of California was formed through Assembly Bill 3121, which effectively brought together a number of 9 individuals to decide what the history and the legacy of enslavement through its lingering effects has been for Black Americans in the state of California. The bill was passed by now, authored rather, by now Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber, and it was signed by Governor Gavin Newsom. And since June 1 of 2021, the task force has been meeting to execute the mandate of the bill. What that mandate is to, 1, establish what the historical role of African enslavement has been in the United States, and to also trace its lingering effects in the lived experience and history of Black Americans in the state of California. This is what we've been doing over the past year. In June, we issued our preliminary report, which has effectively detailed the key areas of injuries that we have determined that Black Americans in the state of California have suffered. And we provided some preliminary recommendations on the basis of those areas. What we will be doing over the next year, because the task force has been assembled for 2 years, and so we sunset in July of 2023. What we'll be doing next year, throughout the next year, is to actually determine what the full reparations recommendation would be, and then pass that recommendation on to the state.
Now, with regard to that detailed response, do you have anything else to add as to what the key recommendations might be? And of course, we realize that you're only speaking for yourself.
Sure, thank you for making a point.
For the Reparations Task Force. But having said that, any glimpse you can provide of key recommendations?
So, we published a report that details, as I mentioned, these 12 areas. Basically, the report is organized with, these 12 chapters that effectively feel like a chronology of the experience and the trauma that Black Americans have faced in the U.S., but specifically focusing on, that history in California. And, so one area, for example, is like environmental racism, right, and infrastructural discrimination. We're talking about the impact that urban renewal had on Black American communities in the state of California and how we might, think about responding to them. And so in each area, we have, provided some preliminary recommendations as how the state might respond, to these historical injuries. However, it's really important to note that those are not our reparations recommendations, right? That's what we have to work on over the next year. And so beginning with our September meeting, we will begin to study various reparations programs, various models, and that's also something that AB 3121 has required us to do, to make sure that what we recommend actually comports to a kind of international standard of reparative and restorative justice. And so we will begin with looking at various reparations models. We will have witnesses and experts come and testify to the variety of reparations programs that can be put together. And then we will begin to take the history and the specific areas of injury that we've been detailing over the past year into account as we work on a reparations proposal. What I should say is that we also have a team of economics experts that are currently working on the actual calculation for what financial compensation could be for those 12 areas. And so what we're talking about is a model that at this point takes nothing off the table. We are thinking about a whole host of let's call it reparative remedies that look like cash-based compensation, direct compensation. That's something that I personally am very much in favor of. Again, a host of supporting programs, what we can think of as being programs that would help to guard against the repetition of these injuries. And so at the moment, to be honest, we've only done the work of detailing the history of African American and Black American disenfranchisement, discrimination in the state. And what we're going to be putting our attention to starting in September is actually coming up with the reparations model.
Well, unfortunately, some of you are captured altogether, but let's move on in any case. One question that has arisen, at least in press reports, is this: to what extent will recommendations cover only Black people with roots in 19th century California slavery, as opposed to Black people with roots in 19th century Louisiana or Texas slavery, for example? Presumably, it would cover those latter two groups to the extent that they or their ancestors experienced the post-slavery regime of Jim Crow, I assume.
Yes. So what we finalized in our March meeting of this year was the community of eligibility. Again, that's something that AB 3121 required that we do. And what we voted on was that the community of eligibility will be Black Americans who are California residents who can determine that they have ancestors who were enslaved in this country. So we did not limit that enslavement to enslavement in the state of California, but to chattel slavery in the United States. And so it's important because what AB 3121 determined was that we study the impacts of African enslavement and then trace its lingering effects. And so by focusing, as AB 3121 did, on the period and the industry and the experience, as a social and cultural experience, as well as an economic process of slavery, it was important that we also identified, and in fact anchored the terms of eligibility to that specific phenomenon. And so again, we're talking about California residents who have ancestors who were enslaved in this country.
So I think it's possible to infer that would exclude California residents who had enslavement roots in the Caribbean, for example.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Now, to what extent did you rely upon texts of scholars such as the Darity and Mullen book From Here to Equality and related texts? So
we relied a lot on witness testimony, expert testimony. The task force did not necessarily take any particular guidance from a set of texts. What we did, and this is why we did a year of it, was we had witnesses, we had individuals who have experienced, again, the 12 areas of, or at least the majority of the 12 areas of injuries that our preliminary report addresses. And so we did what I think is a very grounded assessment of the history of discrimination and disenfranchisement in the state amongst Black American residents of the state of California. Now, what we did have was we had a team of academics who helped to produce the report. We have a couple of teams, like I said, that are doing another set of work for us, like the economics expert team that is helping to kind of tabulate what the cost of these injuries would be. So in that process, multiple texts were referenced. However, as far as the task force itself directly, we derive most of our recommendations, I would say the majority of our recommendations, at least in the public sphere. And it's important to know that all task force collaboration and all task force communication is done only during the public meetings. And so what we had was to rely upon what was provided to us in those public meetings to come to our assessment about what the terms of eligibility are. And in fact, what many of the terms of disenfranchisement and discrimination and injury, what they have been in terms of how we have decided what the scope of our work would be.
Now, I take it that the task force report can be found online by dint of a simple search?
That's right. So you can go to the Department of Justice website. It's there, like oag.ca.gov, and then you can go to the Reparations Task Force page within that website, or you can simply go to your preferred search browser and type in AB 3121, and you should get that result in the first few hits.
Now, to what extent does your task force report correspond with or diverge from what has been called HR 40 in the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington, D.C.?
So I think one of the HR 40 and what we've done with AB 3121 is that we've actually begun the work that HR 40 is proposing to do. Right. So HR 40 is a bill to study the issue of reparations and to hopefully come up with some kind of recommendation, and this is something that we are actively doing right now. So in some ways they share that basic principle, but however we've clearly been at work for the past year. One of the key distinctions, I think, between HR 40 and AB 3121 has been this focus on lineage and the specificity of heritage in determining the community of eligibility. I think HR 40 is still very much a work in progress, and I look forward to seeing what results in the end from the kind of federal push for reparations, because that is still very much, I think, the intention, or at least the hope for myself, is that there is a federal reparations bill. In the interim, it is appropriate for states to take up the work, because the states also have distinct, although related, responsibilities to the histories that Black Americans have faced in terms of their discrimination. However, I think, where AB 3121, or at least the work of the task force, will remain distinct, at least for the time being, is, in our explicit focus on the community of eligibility as being Black Americans who can trace their ancestry to African persons enslaved in the United States.
Now, with regard to what has been called HR 40, there is some question as to whether or not it could get through the U.S. Senate as presently constituted, even if it does pass the House. What about Sacramento? Because we know that whatever recommendations that you come up with, that the state legislature has to pass on, has to concretize. Has there been any kind of assessment of the chances of AB 3121 becoming material and concretized through legislation?
So we have 2 state representatives on the task force, and I think they very likely have their mind set towards the feasibility of our recommendations passing. While that's important, based upon my own principles around this work and what I have done in my own study around reparations, I don't start from the point of feasibility, right? My work in the task force, my work in my scholarship on reparations and notions of repair always begins with the claim that's being made. And so what I'm trying to do, and whatever influence I have on the task force, is to try and make sure that we continue to center the claims of the injured community for whom we are working and trying to bring about repair. What I would like to say is that, for those who are in support of what we are doing, I think it's important for you to mobilize and continue to mobilize, and I take this moment to recognize the very many grassroots organizations that actually got AB 3121 to this point and helped it materialize in the first phase. But it is up to Black residents of the state of California, to do the work of making sure that there are people in office who will get this thing passed. For the task force, I think what we can do and what we're really tasked with doing is by providing an honest and I think principled account of what the history of this community has been in the state of California, and coming up with a reparations plan that actually attends to the experiences and the ongoing effects of those historical experiences for Black American Californians. And that's as far as I take my personal investment in that, because I'm not a politician and I don't know what politicians do. But what I know is that Black American claims for justice have too long been points of negotiation, and I think it's important that we begin to prioritize and privilege and wholeheartedly put forward what the claims of Black Americans are, and to make sure that we advocate for those claims and their fulfillment.
Speaking of politicians, could you refresh our recollection as to who were the legislators who carried AB 3121 and pushed it through Sacramento? Yeah,
so there were several. We know that the bill was authored by now Secretary of State Dr. Shirley Weber. The Reginald Jones Sawyer also had some influence in getting it done. I know that Senator Bradford has also been instrumental in getting it done, and these latter 2 individuals are on the task force.
Finally, Professor Lewis, Associate Professor and Chair of Department of Geography at University of California at Berkeley, and member of the state's Reparations Task Force. To what extent have other U.S. states reached out to you, and to what extent did you consult with folks like Hillary Beckles of Barbados, for example?
To my knowledge, no other states have reached out, and there has been no consultation with Sir Professor Hillary Beckles. The hope is that we will begin to reach out to individuals like Sir Hillary Beckles and other reparationists, certainly in the country, and other states who are doing their own variations of this kind of work, most of which are happening at the really local municipal level. We plan to try and get into conversation by asking such individuals to come as witnesses and provide expert testimony in our meetings beginning in September, as we begin to look at comparative reparations models, again, as AB 3121 mandates that we do. What I would say is that in the state of California, there are several initiatives being pursued, several even in the Bay Area alone where I live, the city of Berkeley, city of Oakland. There is, of course, San Francisco County, as well as the city of Hayward. Each are actually looking at their own variations of some kind of reparative program, for their residents. And so what I do hope is that what there will be in the state of California, at least, is some significant and meaningful collaboration between the various levels of the state to actually bring about some kind of opportunity and hopefully repair for California's Black American residents.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Jovan Lewis, Associate
I
Professor
appreciate you. Yes.
of the Department of Geography at University of California at Berkeley and member of the California State Reparations Task Force. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for having me.
And by the colonial powers of Europe having complete control over Africa, they projected the image of Africa negatively. They projected Africa always in a negative light. Jungles, savages, cannibals, nothing civilized. And naturally it was so negative until it was negative to you and me. And you and I began to hate it. We didn't want anybody to tell us anything about Africa, and much less call us an African. And in hating Africa and hating the African, we ended up even hating ourselves without even realizing it. Because you can't hate the roots of a tree and not hate the tree. You can't hate your origin and not end up hating yourself. You can't hate Africa and not hate yourself. And you'd be surprised. We discovered that deep within the subconscious of the black man in this country, he's still more African than he is American. He thinks that he's more American than African because the man is jiving him and the man is brainwashing him every day.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor Jovan Lewis of the California Reparations Task Force. And we'd like to thank Robert Krehbiel for joining us today as well. Make sure you get into your favorite neighborhood black bookstore today and find Krehbiel's book, Tulsa, 1921, Reporting a Massacre. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Get back onto SO1 Bookstore's website today and expand your library by finding one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone, Baba Didan Kamasi, as well as our dear sister Luyanda Kaboka for giving us the historical drumbeat calendar for the week. Shout out to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. Please continue to support our programming. We are volunteer producers, and the station needs to help pay the bills to keep the lights on and the mics hot in the building. So please dial 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate and support the show. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org, or go to our audio archives on kpfk.org and scroll down to Freedom Now to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
And this is what you got to get in your head here in this country. Just because you in this country doesn't make you an American. And no, you got to go farther than that before you can become an American. You got to enjoy the fruits of Americanism. And you haven't enjoyed those fruits. You've enjoyed the thorns. You've enjoyed the thistles, but you have not enjoyed the fruits. No, sir. As long as we practice brotherhood among ourselves, and then others who want to practice brotherhood with us, we practice it with them also. We're for that. But I don't think that we should run around trying to love somebody who doesn't love us. Thank you.